As the movie begins, we see a little baby being tied to a potty chair in a dark room. She's chained to the same chair for years until she reaches adolescence. In 1970, Katie Standen, a girl who had been imprisoned in a room since the age of 1, is now 13 years old. We see her flipping through a magazine, looking at photographs of people who have had parts of their bodies scribbled over. Just then, her father Wesley walks into the room and begins feeding her. But when Katie spits out the meal, he shouts at her and rubs the food all over her face. Meanwhile, Katie's blind mother, Louise, hears her scream and is disturbed by her husband's cruelty, but she does not intervene. Later, Wesley comes into the living room, and Louise reminds her husband of his promise to get Katie some help if she lives past the age of 12. However, Wesley does not respond to her and instead points a pistol at her. The following morning, after Wesley leaves the house, Louise wakes her son right away and they head to Katie's room. They pull the little girl out of the crib and change her clothes. Then she heads to the welfare office with her daughter while grasping her arm. Katie's dreadful state is noticed by the social worker, who quickly contacts the authorities. Not long after, Katie and Wesley are both arrested and charged with child abuse. In the next scene, Wesley drives home after making bail and breaks down in tears as the news broadcasts their story. The next day, when Louise and her lawyer head to the courthouse, they're surrounded by media people. Louise's attorney asserts that she's innocent and was also abused by her husband. But Wesley cannot endure the humiliation and shame, so he shoots himself and leaves a note behind that says, "The world will never understand." Soon, Katie is taken to a children's hospital where a team of professionals is assembled to help her. Dr. Norman Glazer directs a linguistics student named Sandra Tannen and Dr. Stan York to get to know Katie before conducting tests. When Sandra kneels in front of her, Katie curiously touches her face and hair. Now, Stan and Sandra begin their investigation while teaching Katie how to interact and behave. Katie sneezes in front of them, so Stan demonstrates how to sneeze properly by covering her nose with a tissue. During lunchtime, he teaches Katie how to chew food as he realizes that she was not given enough time to chew food at home. Later in class, Sandra notices Katie conversing with her special education teacher, Judy Bingham. Judy compliments Katie when she successfully answers a question, and she even repeats the word "good" to her teacher. Later, Judy complains to Sandra about how the hospital received so much funding but chose to work with a graduate student rather than a professional. Sandra clarifies that she's not Katie's teacher and is merely present to document her progress. However, Judy boldly claims that she'll teach Katie how to speak and make her famous. The following day, Katie, along with Sandra and the doctor, meet Louise at the canteen. Sandra asks the doctor whether she can question Louise about her daughter's past and why they isolated her. But Stan informs her to be patient for some time, since the court has ruled Louise a victim as well. Then they take Katie outdoors, and on the way, they're surprised to notice Katie touching herself in the back seat. Moments later, they get to the store where Katie heads to the meat area and takes a piece for herself. When the butcher notices this, he gives the little girl raw meat. Katie then sniffs the meat while Sandra and Stan observe her. A few days later, the team places Katie on a hospital bed while she's wired up to an EEG machine to test her brain activity. Afterward, she wakes up and becomes frightened upon seeing her surroundings and throws her hands around. Just then, Sandra walks into the room and stops Katie from removing the notes from her head, and she even soothes Katie by singing her a lullaby. This brings a smile to Katie's face, and for the first time, she calls Sandra by her name. Meanwhile, the doctor shows the group the spindles in her report, which are an indication of birth retardation. Next, Stan and Sandra go for a walk outside with Katie. They discuss her vocabulary and the doctor's diagnosis, which can be either correct or incorrect. As they chat, Katie moves towards a house and a dog begins to bark at her. This reminds her of a time when her father scared her by growling like a dog, and she begins to freak out and scratch herself. Later, Judy approaches Katie and invites her to spend a night at her house. Sandra is suspicious of Judy's motivation and believes she's only using Katie for fame. However, Katie appears to be enthusiastic about the idea, so she goes to Judy's place to spend the night. The following morning, Sandra finds out that Katie's being quarantined at Judy's home after contracting rubella. She later complains to Norman about this, thinking Judy is lying to them. However, Norman is adamant that they must keep the girl at Judy's house since they can't risk infecting the other kids in the hospital. A few days later, when Sandra stops by Judy's house to check on Katie, she's amazed to see the little girl's progress and compliments Judy for her work. While talking about the girl, Judy mentions Katie's tendency to touch herself. She believes she learned it from adults, but Sandra disagrees, claiming that even infants do similar things. The next morning, Stan reveals that Judy has accused him of molesting Katie, and he's forced to resign after the accusation. Sandra immediately goes to Judy's house to confront the matter, but Judy informs her that Katie's worn out by her visits and asks her to stop dropping by. Later, Sandra is still worried about Katie until Norman reveals to her that he and his wife are planning to adopt the little girl. Soon, Norman arrives to pick up the girl, but Judy blames him for depriving Katie of a proper home and threatens him. At her new house, when Katie picks up a magazine and sees photographs of dogs, it triggers her anxiety once again. She instantly tosses it aside and begins scratching herself, while Norman's wife, Beverly, notices this behavior. Then, to entice Katie's attention, Beverly starts beating a pillow to demonstrate another way to express her rage. A few days later, Louise, who has just had surgery to fix her eyes, arrives to visit Katie at the house. When Katie reaches for the applesauce at the dinner table, Beverly and Sandra persuade her to ask vocally. However, Louise gets upset and tells them not to force the child if she doesn't want to. After Louise leaves, Beverly feels that Louise might be upset about the thought of someone else taking the role of Katie's mother. Norman also agrees with her and believes Louise must have felt powerless. The next morning, Beverly wakes Katie up for breakfast, only to discover that she's just gotten her first period. So Sandra pays a visit to Katie and explains menstruation to her. Days later, Katie begins kindergarten and meets her younger classmates. While riding the school bus, she likes the bus driver named Kurt, whom she clings to even after being taken home. One day, Sandra teaches Katie sentence formation, but the little girl finds it extremely difficult. When Norman arrives, he notices that specialists from the National Institute of Mental Health have come to examine their research on the little girl. As they're talking, Katie spits on the floor and Sandra scolds her for bad behavior. Later that evening, Norman informs Sandra that their research was not well received by the specialists and worries that they might lose their grant. Later, Sandra plays a song on the piano that reminds Katie of the time Wesley beat her. She notices that the girl is afraid but is unable to express her feelings. The following day, Sandra takes Katie and Louise to the beach, hoping to change her mood and make her feel better. While Katie is busy playing, Louise informs her that Wesley used to beat Katie if she made a noise, and to keep her quiet, he'd often strike her with a stick or snarl like a dog, which explains her fear of dogs. That evening, Sandra introduces her boyfriend Rob to Katie, who's overjoyed to have a new friend. She even shows him something she sewed. Soon, Sandra analyzes her documents and finds that Katie hasn't made any progress. She tells Norman that while Katie's learning new words, she's unable to form grammatically accurate sentences. However, Sandra recalls Katie communicating herself through movements and gestures, so they decide to teach Katie sign language, which she quickly learns. Unfortunately, Katie's grant is terminated and she's brought into her mother's custody. Norman sends Katie back to Louise's house, where she now has a better bedroom. However, Katie starts to cry when she hears Norman leaving. A few days later, Sandra pays a visit to Louise and informs her that she's submitted a funding proposal to work with Katie again. But on the other hand, Louise has decided to send Katie to a childcare institute since she's difficult to cope with. Concerned that an institute might hinder Katie's progress, Sandra proposes that she be placed in a foster home instead, and Louise agrees. Katie is quickly placed with her new foster family, the Mannings. But this family is strict in some areas, as they won't let Katie wear jewelry or use sign language. One day, Katie throws up while eating breakfast, something that disgusts her foster parents, who punish her severely. That evening, Sandra visits the family, but the couple insist that Katie's not allowed to see anyone as a punishment. When she brings up Katie's past, the Mannings simply respond by saying that all their foster children came from odd backgrounds, but they don't act like animals. Nonetheless, Sandra checks on the little girl, but she refuses to talk, scared of throwing up again. Next, Sandra calls Norman and asks him to help her get Katie out of the Mannings, and he quickly agrees. In the meantime, she returns to the Mannings to care for Katie, but since the girl refuses to open her lips, Sandra has difficulty feeding her. A few days later, Sandra requests that the social worker in charge of Katie relocate her promptly because she refuses to speak or eat. But the social worker believes it's Katie's fault and refuses to take any action. When Sandra returns to Katie, she realizes that the girl has been injuring herself. Eventually, Norman takes advantage of his position to return Katie to the hospital. Now, Sandra consults with Amanda, who's in charge of Katie's case. She suggests that Katie moves in with her because they already get along very well. Sandra talks about this with Rob, but he doesn't think it's a good idea since she's still in college. When Sandra returns to the hospital to see Katie, she discovers that Louise has already taken her. She immediately goes to Louise, who states that she's placed Katie somewhere that she chose. Furthermore, Louise accuses her of treating Katie like an experiment and forbids Sandra and the other team members from ever seeing her daughter again. Sandra knows she cannot go against the mother, but she asks Louise why Wesley isolated Katie for all those years. Louise tells her that no one understood Wesley but his mother, whom he adored more than anything. But all of that changed when his mother was hit by a car while crossing the street. Then they moved into her house, and Wesley slept in his mother's former bedroom while his wife and son slept in the living room. Katie was given a room to herself, where she was imprisoned. Years ago, a doctor told them that Katie was retarded, so Wesley kept her locked up in the room, trying to avoid the authorities finding out about her illness and taking her away. Around the same time, Louise was starting to go blind, so Wesley eventually became Katie's primary caregiver. As Sandra leaves the house, she sees Judy walking toward Louise. Here, she realizes that Louise believed Judy's accusations against her and her team. Before Judy enters the house, she gets into a brief argument with Sandra, which makes her emotional. Later, Sandra watches their tapes to relive their memories, as she's restricted from seeing Katie ever again. Several years later, Sandra expresses her good wishes for Katie and feels that she should have provided the girl with memories she could cherish. She then carries her newborn and sings a lullaby to her. It's then revealed that Sandra is still prohibited from seeing Katie, who resides in a foster home nearby. Meanwhile, Judy hasn't stopped accusing Katie's team, while Louise has once again gone blind, and the movie ends.